Welcome back, Phil 301. Dr. K here. I hope you all are getting after it. So in our last video, we talked about Maimonides' taxonomy of attributes. If you remember, attributes are terms that specify a thing in some way, and Maimonides took there to be two main kinds of attributes, positive and negative. And there are a bunch of subcategories of positive attributes. We had essential attributes, accidental or qualitative attributes, relational attributes, and attributes of action. And there are further subcategories of some of these. So for example, under essential attributes, we can have repetitive, fully defining or explanatory attributes, and partially defining attributes. And under relational attributes, the subcategories were temporal attributes, spatial attributes, and individual attributes. Remember also, I mentioned throughout that video that Maimonides takes it that various of these positive attributes cannot be predicable of God, or you can't predicate them of God and make true statements about God. In this video, we're going to discuss which attributes Maimonides excludes from being predicable of God and the reasons that he gives for their exclusion. And we're going to look at the reasons at two levels of detail. At first, we're going to kind of do an overview and talk about which ones he excludes and why generally. And then we're going to look at his arguments in more detail. So let's start with an overview of the attributes that Maimonides excludes from being predicable of God and the reasons that he gives for their exclusion. Okay, so remember, attributes are terms that specify a thing in some way. Positive attributes are terms that specify a thing by indicating or describing at least some part of the totality of the thing. Now, let's talk about which of the positive attributes Maimonides excludes from being predicable of God and why. Let's start with the essential attributes. And remember, essential attributes are terms that specify a thing by either repetitively identifying it with itself or defining it. So the first class of essential attributes that we discussed were repetitive attributes. That's to say, attributes which define a thing with itself. The example we looked at here was man is man. Maimonides takes this type of attribute to be predicable of God, but it's not helpful. So you can say, you can make a true statement if you predicate God of God. You say God is God. That's true, but it's unhelpful. It doesn't tell us anything about God's nature or what God's like. It just says God is God. Okay, let's move to the next type of essential attributes. That's to say fully defining or explanatory attributes. And remember, these are terms that specify a thing by fully defining it. That's to say, by fully specifying the parts that make it up or cause it. The example that we looked at here was man is a rational animal. So Maimonides says that this type of attribute can't be applied to God
because it implies that God is caused or depends on things outside of himself. And Maimonides denies this. He takes God to be uncaused.
So you can't fully define God. You can't say, for example, God is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being. That wouldn't be a true statement on Maimonides' view. What about the third kind of essential attribute, namely partially defining attributes? Remember, these are terms that specify a thing by partially defining it. And the example we looked at here was man is rational. Maimonides claims this type of attribute can't be applied to God because it implies that he is compound. So, for example, we can't even say God is powerful or God is all good. Moving on to accidental or qualitative attributes. Remember, these are terms that specify a thing not by defining it in any way, but by indicating something in it. That's to say, some quality or property or accident that it has. The example we looked at here was Zayed is nice. Niceness is a quality that Zayed has, but it's not what defines Zayed. It's not what makes him what he is. It's something he could lose at one time, but still be Zayed. Maimonides claims that this type of attribute can't be applied to God because it implies that he is compound as well.
For example, you can't even say something like God is all powerful, where power is not even taken to be a fully defining or partially defining attribute of God. Something that in whole or part makes him or causes him to be what he is, but where you mean power to be something like an accident or a quality of God, that's to say something he could have at one time but lose at another. So you can't even say God is all powerful when you mean power in that qualitative sense.
What about relational attributes? Remember, relational attributes were terms that specify a thing by indicating its relation to something else, such as time, place, or another individual. There were three kinds: temporal, spatial, and individual relational attributes. Temporal attributes, you remember, specify a thing by indicating its relation to time. The example we looked at here was Zayed was born in 1202. Maimonides claims this type of attribute can't be applied to God because it implies he is a body. But Maimonides is going to deny that God is a body. So, for example, you can't truly say things like God was before you were born, and God will be after you cease to exist, or God was born in a certain time, or God is simultaneous with your existence. Any type of attribute that discusses a relation to time, such as before, after, simultaneous, or, being born
At a certain time,
cannot be truly predicated of God. Spatial attributes, remember, specify a thing by indicating its relation to space or place. The example we looked at here was Zayed is in the blue house. Of this attribute, Maimonides claims it can't be applied to God because doing so implies, again, that he is a body, and Maimonides is going to deny that God is a body.
so, for example, you can't truly say of God things like God is in the house, or even God is in the world, or further in the universe. You can't say he's below the earth, above the earth, next to the earth. Any type of attribute that suggests God has some relation to place, therefore, any type of spatial attribute is inapplicable to God.
What about individual relational attributes? Individual relational attributes, remember, were terms that specify a thing by indicating its relation to another individual. One of the examples we looked at here was Zayed is the father of Bakar. Maimonides claims that this type of attribute can't be applied to God because doing so implies similarity between God and creatures. And Maimonides is going to argue that there is no similarity whatsoever between God and creatures. So what about attributes of action? Attributes of action, remember, were terms that specify a thing by indicating the action it is carried out. So, one example that we considered was Zayed is the person who made this door. Maimonides takes this type of attribute to be attributable to God. So you could say, for example, that God caused the world.
Or God made the universe.
So that covers what Maimonides says about the applicability of the positive attributes to God. Let's turn now to look at what he says about the applicability of negative attributes to God. Remember, negative attributes are terms that specify a thing not by indicating some part of its totality, or some quality it has, or some relation to time, place, or space that it has, or something that it does, but by eliminating candidate parts of its totality from our imagination. The example we used, we said, well, assume there's a man far off in the distance and someone says, what is that? Someone might say, well, it's not a vegetable. In that case, not a vegetable was a negative attribute. Maimonides claims that this type of attribute can be truly applied to God. So, for example, you can say things like, God is not bad, or God is not weak, or God is not stupid. Those are perfectly fine and constitute true sentences. Okay, so let us now take stock of what we've done so far, what we said so far. So, repetitive attributes can be truly predicated of God. fully defining or explanatory attributes cannot be truly predicated of God. This is because they imply that God is compound, right? He has parts that make him up, and that he is caused or dependent on things outside of himself. Partially defining attributes cannot be truly predicated of God because they imply that God is compound. Accidental or qualitative attributes cannot be truly predicated of God because they imply that he is compound. Temporal relational attributes cannot be truly predicated of God because they imply that he's a body or a physical object. Spatial relational attributes cannot be truly predicated of God because they imply that he is a body or physical object. Individual relational attributes cannot be truly predicated of God because they imply some similarity between God and creatures. Action attributes or attributes of action can be truly predicated of God. And negative attributes can be truly predicated of God. So in short, he takes these types of attributes to be unpredicable of God because they either imply that he is dependent on things outside of himself or caused, compound, that's to say composite or having parts, is physical or a body, or that there's some similarity between creatures and himself. Repetitive action and negative attributes, however, can be truly predicated of God because they do not imply any composition or compoundness on his part, that he is caused or dependent on things outside of himself, that he is a body or physical object, and they do not imply any similarity between himself and creatures. The rub, however, is that repetitive attributes don't tell us anything about God, right? You can make a true statement then about God. For example, you can say God is God, but that doesn't tell us anything about what God is like or his nature. Attributes of action just describe what he does, and again, do not describe him or tell us anything about him. Negative attributes tell us what he is not, and again, so they don't tell us anything about God himself. They just tell us what he is not. Okay, so we've had a quick run through, refresher of what all these attributes are. We've looked at which of the ones Maimonides denies are truly applicable to God, and we've looked quickly at the reasons why. Now I want to look in more detail at the arguments he gives to exclude these attributes from being truly predicable of God.
Okay, let's first look at his argument against fully defining or explanatory attributes applying to God. Runs as follows. Premise 1. Explanatory attributes specify the causes of a thing's being what it is. For example, something is a man on account of animality and rationality coming together. 2. Thus, if God could be truly described with explanatory attributes, God would be caused. He would depend on those things that make him what he is. His existence would depend on the existence of those things that make him what he is. 3, but God is uncaused. 4, thus God cannot be described with the explanatory attributes. And in some, the implication of this, if we take a definition of a thing to be the statement of the fully defining or explanatory attributes of a thing, then it follows God cannot be defined. Now let's look at Maimonides' argument against partially defining attributes applying to God. Premise 1. Partially defining attributes specify only part of what a thing is. 2. Thus, if God could be truly described with partially defining attributes, God would have parts. 3. God has no parts. We'll see more about why Maimonides thinks this when we consider his argument for the existence of God. 4. Thus, God cannot be truly described with partially defining attributes. Right? So, if we look at what a partially defining attribute is and specifying only part of what a thing is or part of what makes a thing what it is, then if you could truly apply them of God, the idea here then is that God would have parts, but he doesn't on Maimonides' view. And again, we'll see why when we look at his argument for the existence of God. Now let's turn to Maimonides' argument against qualitative attributes or accidents being truly predicable of God. Premise one: qualities are things added to something's essence. That's to say, they exist in that essence. Like, take for example, again, the statement, Zayed is nice. Niceness is something that's in Zayed. It's not something that defines him or makes him up or is essential to him. It's something that's in him. In the same way, you could say Zayed is angry. In that case, anger would be a quality or accident that Zayed had because it's something that is in him, but that he can lose. That's not essential to him or defining of him. Premise two: so if God could be truly described with qualities, God would be compound. That's to say, he'd be an essence plus a quality or accident compound. So, for example, in the case of Zayed, remember, we're taking Zayed to be a man or a human being, so he's going to be a rational animal, which has the quality of being nice. So, in that sense, you have his essence is rational animal, and in that essence is the quality of niceness, but it's something that could be lost at a given time. And in that sense, things that can have qualities are compounds because they have essences, or which are things that they can't lose and remain in existence, and then they have qualities in that essence, which are things that they cannot lose or have it sometimes and not at others. So if God could be described with qualities, then he'd be a compound in the sense of being an essence with qualities inhering in it. Right? But God is not compound. He has no parts whatsoever. And again, we'll see Maimonides' argument for this claim, or the reason he takes this God not to have parts, when we look at his argument for the existence of God. Thus, 4, God cannot be truly described with qualitative attributes either. Right? So you can't predicate qualitative attributes or accidents of God. Now let's turn to Maimonides' argument against temporal relation or temporal attributes applying to God. Premise 1, time or temporal location is a quality of motion. And I told you in the first video that in certain respects, Maimonides is an Aristotelian, and this view that time is a quality of motion or change is one of Aristotle's views. Premise 2, motion is a quality of bodies. Right? Bodies are in one place at one time and at another place at another. They move and change place in that respect. They have one color at one time and a different color at another. So at one time they're small, and at a later time they can grow or get bigger. But it's bodies only that are open to this type of motion or change. Premise 3, but God is not a body. And again, we'll look at Maimonides' reasoning for why God is not a body when we look at his argument for the existence of God. 4, thus, God cannot be truly described with temporal attributes. So God is not in time, right? You can't talk about a year in which God came into being, as all bodies and hence all things that have existence in time do. You can't talk about God having certain temporal relations, like, for example, being before something else or after something else or simultaneous with something else. Now let's look at Maimonides' argument against spatial relations, or spatial attributes applying to God. Premise 1, spatial location applies only to bodies. What is it to be in space or to be located in space, but to take up space, to be extended in space? That is only something that bodies or extended objects can do. Premise 2, God is not a body. Again, we're going to see more about why he thinks God not to be a body when we look at his argument for the existence of God. So look, if spatial location applies only to bodies and God is not a body, then it follows as in 3 that therefore God cannot be truly described with spatial attributes. You can't say of God, for example, that he's above something or below something or next to something, behind something, in front of something, in something. These are all spatial relations and things which only apply to bodies, and God is not a body, and hence you can't apply spatial attributes to him and make true statements. Lastly, let's look at Maimonides' argument against individual relations being predicable of God. Premise 1, if X stands in a relation to Y, then X and Y share something in common. For example, if X stands in the taller than relation to Y, then X and Y both share height. Premise 2, but God shares nothing in common with creation or creatures. If you want to read Maimonides saying this, check out pages 63 and 70 of the guide. 3, thus God stands in no relation with creation. 4, if God stands in no relation with creation, then individual relational attributes can't be truly predicated of God. 5, thus individual relational attributes cannot be truly predicated of God.
All right, so in this video, we went over which categories of attributes Maimonides took to be applicable to God and which he took to be inapplicable. We saw that the only ones he took to be applicable to God were repetitive, action, and negative attributes. All the others he took to be non-predicable about God, at least if you want to make true statements about God. You can't use those. There was a lot here, I know, and we went into detail into what his reasoning was as to why some of the attributes cannot be truly predicated of God. Of course, we can't cover everything. We'd be here forever, right? So take stock of what we've done as best you can. And if you have questions or need further clarification, you can always ask. Put it in the comments below. In the next video, what we're going to do is look at the implications of him excluding various of these kinds of positive attributes from being truly predicable of God. We'll see Maimonides takes it to have implication for how you're supposed to read or understand various statements in the Bible, which seem to predicate these positive attributes of God. And we'll also see it has implications for our ability to apprehend what God is. So this is where the payoff's coming in from all this hard work and this technical discussions that we've been having. So I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.